Thanks for having me here at this great conference. It's an honor. Since we don't have much time, I want to just dive right in. In February 2020, an article by Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben was published in Italy. Therein, he described the emerging COVID pandemic as an invention of the state to legitimize a deliberate state of emergency. This remark by Agamben was only the prelude to an affair that developed in the following month. Agamben not only repeated his crude claims on COVID politics, but also prominently compared them to National Socialist politics and drew references to the orchestrator of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann. Barely a month later, in the same spring of 2020, another debate unfolded, this time not in Italy, but in Germany. The invitation of Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe, as we've heard in the last talk already, to the art festival Ruhr Triennale was publicly criticized because Mbembe had compared Israeli politics with the Holocaust several times in the past. In his book Necropolitics, for example, he had spoken of Israeli politics as originating from the same delusion of separation that once gave rise to the Holocaust. Both controversies were discussed at length. There has been considerable genuine criticism of both Agamben's and Mbembe's positions. What went unnoticed, however, was the undeniable similarity between the two political positionings of these philosophers, as well as the common background underlying them. Both had more or less explicitly compared phenomena of contemporary politics to the Holocaust. Both are substantially influenced by the idea of biopolitics coined by Michel Foucault. Therefore, in this talk, I would like to participate less in the debate surrounding Agamben and Mbembe in a direct way. I think this has already been done in sufficient ways. Rather, I want to shed light on the fact that these seemingly very different statements made by the two philosophers are not particularly surprising given their background in biopolitical theory. My point is to show how Agamben's and Mbembe's statements originate in theories of biopolitics, rather than treating them as mere slips that supposedly happen to genius minds now and then. For this purpose, I will limit myself to the borrowings that Agamben and Mbembe make in their thinking from Foucault's notion of biopolitics. It's not the claim to reproduce Agamben's or Mbembe's philosophy in full here. Let me start by giving a short introduction into Foucault's theory of biopolitics. I mainly refer this in Foucault's words. The concept of biopolitics first finds systematic application in Foucault's lecture Society Must Be Defended, given at Collège de France, and in his opus magnum, The History of Sexuality, both from 1976. In Modernity, Foucault argues, sovereign power transforms from being repressive to being a productive instance. According to him, it no longer merely represses life, but produces, shapes, and promotes it itself. Foucault sums up this transformation with the term biopolitics, which refers to the fact that the biological becomes the field of politics. In contrast to disciplinary power, biopolitical power, according to Foucault, does not target the individual body, but the population as a whole and functions as a regulating power. Examples are for biopolitics would be state action to regulate birth rates or contain contagious diseases, as we've seen with COVID-19. In turn, though, according to Foucault, biopolitics at the same time give rise to modern racism, because to maintain the state's power to kill, exclude, or discriminate people, he argues, a discourse is established that directly links the death of some to the life of others. In this way, according to him, repression, including murder on the part of the state, could be justified by placing it within the service of life. For example, contributing to public health or security, purifying the body of the people, and so on. These would be examples for those kind of discourses. Modern racism then, according to Foucault, functions less through the construction of, and that's very important, I think, of races in a plural way, rather through the construction of a race in singular, which is to be constantly optimized through the exclusion of a supposedly harmful part. So far, Foucault, a very short introduction into the concept of biopolitics. Both Agamben and Mbembe have centrally connected to this Foucauldian theory, but I don't have time to go into that right now. However, in consideration of the time, I want to ask, how was the Holocaust interpreted within theories of biopolitics? So how was the Holocaust conceived by these theories? In which way was its particularity on the one hand and its relation to the universal on the other grasped? Surprisingly, I think, in Foucault's work, there are hardly any comments on Nazi policy of extermination against the Jews, nor on Nazism in general. 2 pages of remarks on Nazism that Foucault makes at the end of his lecture, Society Must Be Defended, are one of his longest statements on this topic. There, Foucault places the Holocaust in a broader perspective of Nazi biopolitics, which he in turn understands as the most consistent form of modern biopolitical racism. National socialism is, and I quote Foucault here, in fact, the paroxysmal development of the new power mechanisms that had been established since the 18th century, he says. He means disciplinary and biopower here. They are, I quote again, inscribed in the workings of all states. Therefore, Foucault argues, biopolitical racism was at peak under the Nazis. So not just the biopolitical, but biopolitical racism also, Foucault sees at peak under the Nazis. Now, because biopolitical racism conceptualizes race, as I've mentioned, in singular, the goal of the National Socialists was, according to Foucault now, not really, and this is very interesting what he says, and very, I think, very problematic, not really the destruction of other races, he says, but also to expose its own race to the absolute and universal threat of death through war, end of quote. Nazi Germany was for Foucault, I quote, again, I quote again Foucault, an absolutely racist state, an absolutely murderous state, and an absolutely suicidal state. The result, he says, was of course both the final solution and then Telegram 71, in which in April 1945, Hitler gave the order to destroy Germany's own living conditions. So yeah, let that sink in. I think it's very problematic that he puts the Holocaust in line with an alleged Aryan suicide. But that's not all. Interestingly, he also notes that the final solution supposedly was, I quote, the attempt to eliminate, by eliminating the Jews, all the other races of which the Jews were both the symbol and the manifestation. Yet, because this statement by Foucault on Nazism is one of very few, as mentioned, it remains unclear whether it adequately reflects his thinking on National Socialism and the Holocaust. However, Foucault's overall silence on the subject has not prevented Agamben and Mbembe from analyzing the Holocaust from a biopolitical perspective. In Homo Sacer, Agamben even wonders why the analysis of new techniques of power, such as biopower, did not conclude, I quote, with an analysis of the concentration camp, end of quote. Agamben and Mbembe tried to complete just that. For them, the concentration camps are mere examples of biopolitical policies taken to extreme. What is striking, I think, is that in their analysis, the Holocaust is not associated at all with anti-Semitism. Instead, Agamben, for example, places the Holocaust in the, I quote, general context of socialism's legislation, National Socialism's legislations and biopolitical praxis, end of quote. It is not by chance that Agamben defines this biopolitical legislation in relation to organics. This amounts to his view that the extermination of European Jews was only part of a general biopolitical rage of extermination that would have affected, I quote, even citizens of Aryan blood. As you can see, this is also the same argument as Foucault already made in his remarks, talking about the Aryan suicide. Well, I think the Aryan suicide never happened, but the Holocaust did, and this already should say it all. Mbembe initially appears as an exception here, emphasizing not so much the extension of biopolitical killing to all citizens under the Nazis, but rather the genesis of National Socialist biopolitics from colonial biopolitical practices. According to Mbembe, biopolitical mechanisms of power were tested in the colonies and later applied in the Holocaust. The Jews were declared, according to Mbembe, and persecuted, according to Mbembe, as savages, just like the colonized. That's what he says. But this view is also questionable. My claim is that the Holocaust cannot be explained from the logic of biopolitical racism in general, not in the case of Agamben and not in the case of Mbembe. As already stressed in the literature, the assumption that the Jews were exterminated because they were considered harmful to the biopolitical body of the people cannot explain why all Jews, even those outside the own body of the people, or as the Nazis called it, Volkskörper, were targets of extermination. Nor can it explain why Jews in particular, and not likewise all other persons who did not conform to the Aryan ideal of the Volkskörper, became targets of extermination. To explain these particularities, one needs an understanding of antisemitism, I think. In summary, for Agamben and Mbembe, and with some limitations also for Foucault, the Holocaust constitutes the final consequence of the functioning of modern states. To that end, they disconnect the Holocaust, I think, from a distinct German anti-Semitic history, including its elements that point to a rebellion in whatever way against aspects of modernity. Rather, the Holocaust appears to be a mere example of modern biopolitical universality only taken to extreme. As Ingo Elbo points out, the Holocaust is, I quote, understood as a mere application of a general principle of domination in these theories. End of quote. Consequently, Foucault can come to the conclusion that the Nazis, I quote Foucault again, only attempted to eliminate, I had that quote already, by eliminating the Jew or the other races of which the Jews were both the symbol and the manifestation. So he only sees them as a symbol and manifestation of the elimination of all the other races, how he puts it. In this logic, only general misanthropy was perpetrated against them, against the Jews, as Elbe accurately puts it. Let's return to the controversies surrounding Agamben and Mbembe. These can be better understood in light of the theoretical background of the two philosophers. As emphasized in series of Biopolitics, the Holocaust is deprived of those particular characteristics that distinguish it as a German anti-Semitic crime against the Jews in order to use it as a general example of the functioning of modern statehood with its biopolitical mechanisms of power. That's why the Holocaust cannot be optionally placed in a theoretical line with state pandemic measures, as in the case of Agamben, or contemporary Israeli politics, as in the case of Mbembe. This is also why, as in Agamben's case, ludicrous comparisons can be made, such as the one in a 2004 article, in which he compares the obligation to give fingerprints when entering the United States to the tattooing of concentration camp inmates at Auschwitz. If I have one more minute, I would like to conclude by quoting Foucault, who seems to have had the foresight to see coming of what he himself was not entirely innocent of. I quote Foucault. Now, it seems to me that these themes, what he means here is themes that see the state as in tendency fascist, that these themes put in circulation what could be called an inflationary critical value, an inflationary critical currency. Why inflationary? In the first place, it is inflationary because I think the theme encourages the growth at a constantly accelerating speed of the interchangeability, I think that's important, of the interchangeability of analysis. For example, an analysis of social security and the administrative apparatus on which it rests ends up referring us to the analysis of concentration camps, he says. And in the move from social security to concentration camps, this requisite specificity of analysis is diluted. So there is inflation in the sense of an increasing interchangeability of analysis and loss of specificity. So far, Foucault. Thank you very much.